2020. Third, please call the roll.
Mayor Lockenbrock,
Here.
Council President Isom,
Here.
Councilor Lacoste,
Here.
Councilor Lorenzen, Councilor McMillan, Councilor Romer,
Here.
Councilor Strauss.
Here.
Please rise for. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And I'm guessing there's no agenda adjustments.
No, since there's only one agenda item,
Yeah.
unless y'all want to go home with that,
Okay.
waste all this work.
Like to, but
Let's kick this down the road. So the purpose of the work session is to review information and discuss options to comply with the new state laws regarding public camping and to give staff direction on what amendments to propose for the municipal code. I understand your presentation.
I do. Rather than read you the staff report, which I hope you read, I'm gonna run through a PowerPoint. And what I did was set this up to try to break it into manageable pieces. So if it goes the way I expect, you might be able to talk about one of those pieces, kind of decide how you feel about it, and move on to the next piece. So that, because there's so many different moving parts, just try to narrow it down. Okay, so, and Maddie's gonna run slides for me.
Broke the internet.
I don't know why it's showing you this. It looks right on our screen.
Yeah.
Here's your slides in now. But that's okay.
It's showing me like notes and stuff in the next slide.
Interesting.
you're supposed to read those.
Yeah, okay. You can move to the next slide now. All right, so I grabbed 3 questions from another presentation. Have you ever experienced homelessness? Do you know anyone who has or is experiencing homeless? And do you know anyone in Halsey who is housing insecure? You were talking about people, about learning at the school board, about people who are housing insecure, about children who are. I've known, in the 10 years I've been working for the city, I've known 2 people homeless in Halsey, and both of them were from Halsey, and that's a part of why they stayed. One had lived here for decades, and his family sold the house he was living in after his mom died, and he moved into an RV and was trying to live in city. The other one, similarly, she sold her father's house after he passed, and she had somewhere to live for a while, which when she no longer had somewhere to live, she came back and she lived in the yard in Halsey and at 10. So, and I mentioned this only because, well, and also, Ken isn't here, but he would tell you that he and Jenny were a hair's breadth from homelessness at one point. So I mentioned this just because when I started thinking about who here is or has been homeless, both of the examples I could come up with were Halsey residents. So we tend to picture horrible camps of people coming in from outside Halsey. And I don't know of anybody whose house is now, but the incidents I could think of were both from people inside Halsey. So we're also talking about our own. And that's all. So we're gonna. Okay. So yes, this burden has just been displaced onto local governments, which is extremely unfair and unfortunate, but it is so. And the basis for that in the Morton versus Boise was that an ordinance violates the 8th Amendment insofar as it imposes criminal sanctions against a homeless individual for sleeping outdoors on public property when they have no alternative shelter. So let's go to the next one, because I don't want to take too much time. Okay, so this is the first choose your own adventure chunk. Can you read that? Or is it too small?
I cannot read it.
Okay,
Kind of, sort of.
then I'm gonna read it to you.
Okay.
This is our existing municipal code. There are literally 2 lines in our existing municipal code that have to be changed before July 1st. So the bare minimum would be to change the 3 lines.
Right.
I would like it if you would go further and look at the other issues to try to come up with a camping ordinance, because if you use these 2 lines, you've created a free-for-all where anybody can park any RV and camp anywhere on any right of way, any time, for as long as they want. So to be legally compliant, we have to change these 2 lines, and I'll read them out to you. But it's still a good idea to have the rest of this meeting and see what else we can work out. So, C is, so this says, except as prohibited in subject sections 2 and 3 of this section, it shall be unlawful to park any motor truck, recreational vehicle, trailer, or boat in the streets within the city. A travel trailer, camper, or mobile residence may be used for sleeping or housekeeping purposes only under one of the following circumstances. It is located in an approved recreational vehicle park. It is located on the premises of a private residence and shall be occupied for a period of not more than 14 consecutive days within a 28-day period. C, it is located within the street right of way and shall not be parked, occupied for a period of more than 96 consecutive hours within a 14-day period. If you struck within a 14-day period, you would now be legal. And D, relocating the travel trailer, camper, or other mobile residence from one location on the public right of way to another location at least 400 feet on the public right of way shall not extend the time limits for another 96 hours. So if you strike shall not, actually right now it just says shall not extend the time limits. You struck shall not and just make it shall extend the time limits for another 96 hours. We would be legally compliant if you change those two things. So that is the very simplest thing. And you could do that before July 1st and then keep working on the camping ordinance, and that would give you more time because this feels like a rush.
It does.
So that would give you more time, but you just have to be aware that until you put something else in place, if somebody parks an RV on the street, I can't do anything about it. And if somebody decides to live in an RV on the street, I can't do anything about it until you have a different ordinance.
Is that 96 hours set in stone? We
Now you can
shorten
choose
that.
You can choose a period of time, but what you can't do is. So the way it is now, you can have 96 hours within a 14-day period, which
Right.
means those other 10 days you have to like take the camper out of policy.
Right.
You can't do that. So you could say 72 hours and then you have to move it. You could say 24 hours and then you have to move it. You could say a week and then you have to move it. You can change the period of time. But what you can't do is make it so that they then have to move it out of town. You have to let them just move it somewhere else inside town.
The big problem that I've had since day one on this is that we have a finite amount of space. Now, admittedly, our homeless problem is not significant as far as Junction City or Harrisburg or not really Harrisburg, but the large communities. I think that 96 hours is a bit long.
It doesn't, in terms of the amount of space we have, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Because they'll just move down the street and take another 96 hours.
Well, and correct. The concern I have with that is kind of doing a racetrack kind of a situation. And then if they start doing that, does that fall under our nuisance ordinance?
Well, if it does, we have to change the nuisance ordinance.
Right.
We don't,
Am I allowed to say?
yeah, as long as we move forward, yeah.
I'm just saying, the 96-hour thing though, like we have a neighbor who parks an RV for when their kids come for over the weekend.
That's what I was
And
gonna
if
bring
you
up
have the
too.
96 hours, then you're no longer allowing people to use
Sure.
the right of way to camp in their RV over a weekend.
That's
Long weekend or whatever.
That's what that period of time is.
That's 4 days, so.
Yeah,
Well, currently right across from our house, we have an RV that's been there for a couple weeks and it doesn't look, I mean, they pretty much look like they've set up shop there for.
we're about to do our first seasonal drive around and she's gonna be checking right of ways, and so
I took a
everybody.
picture of that 2 weeks ago, but we were in the process of this, so we haven't.
And so for this work session, what is the goal? Is that kind of what you're asking?
The goal for the work session is for you to tell me what ordinance you want me to write. And there are so many variables. We tried to talk about this in a meeting. When Ross had given a fairly simple solution and we very quickly went down the rabbit hole. Several people said it'd be useful to have a dedicated work session where all you're doing is working on this. So I gave you model ordinances from other cities. I've broken this down into different categories of things you may have seen in those ordinances. And written out or described what your options are. Yeah, we have to do something or we can get sued on July 2nd.
Right.
All right, and that's what I'm trying to prevent.
So do we want to set up a camping ordinance and an RV ordinance separately? Or is that, you know,
You are jumping ahead, sir, but yes, very good.
yeah, and do,
My recommendation would be.
Yes.
and do we want ordinances for both of those items by the time we leave here today?
Well, if you give me direction, I will write the ordinance and bring it to you in the next council meeting. So you don't have to have it written today, but you do have to give me within a particular category. Yes, I want to allow churches to host people with certain restrictions, or no, I don't want churches to host people with certain restrictions. Yes, and I do want to just change this language and then schedule another work session so we have more time and we'll take the risk with the fact that maybe RVs on the right of ways for a few weeks or a few months, or no, I want to go ahead and choose some time, place, and manner restrictions so we can protect our. There, each of these slides is a different question, so this is the first one. And yeah, the goal is that hopefully to have sort of a more coherent conversation than the last one, with more background material to sort of add into that conversation. And I'd love it if you came out with what you want me to write. What do you want to change about the code? The bare minimum? And you'll take the lumps, or
No,
a little bit more than that.
So can we use an existing ordinance as a template, the one that's closest to our position,
Yeah,
and then mix and match?
yes, you can, with one caveat. Our attorney would never approve the ordinances that were in there for Brownsville.
Yeah,
I did not want to conceal them for you.
no, I think that was great to include them.
Sympathy with the emotion behind them. Neighbor, friend, mentor, all of that. But if you are all passionately devoted to the idea of having ordinances just like Brownsville, I'm gonna go.
Yeah, absolutely not.
It just made me laugh.
They sounded angry and
Oh, yes.
I'm
glad you're getting the bill.
not sure that some of that is even legal.
Well, I will tell you that my belief is the city of Halsey,
yeah.
my belief is the city of Halsey does not have the authority to build the state for nothing.
Yes, exactly.
And I really, really hate ordinances that are, if you pass an ordinance, the expectation is that I'm gonna make it happen. So I really like it, something I can do.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a few nuts in there that squirrels came up with that aren't really related to what they were talking about either. Right.
I liked the Newport ordinance as a pretty good model and a pretty sensible one, but there was good language. I was actually surprised. I found some really useful language in some of the ones from many bigger cities. Redmond and Bend both had place and restriction that I liked and thought was sensible. But yes, in fact, if you said, Hillary, write me an ordinance, this is what I wanted to say, you know what I would do? I'd start using these ordinances and going through and picking out the things that say what you wanted to say, and
I like Jefferson's, specifically the permitted camping on private property. Which is the truth is.
yeah.
With the new, because I read through like the new law and stuff, but since I know you've been talking to a lawyer, I know in the past, because in 3 other cities I've been volunteered to sit on their homeless negotiation. So this is my 4th time doing this conversation in different cities.
Oh my God.
But
Believe us.
in the past, I know if it was on private property, they had to have facilities, access to facilities. So they had to have a washroom, they had to have an open bathroom that was there for 24 hours, which a church can offer that, but that has to be offered and it has to be advertised that it was offered. Is that still in part of the state law? Because
I don't know if every ordinance that I saw that had that chunk in it about business owners or nonprofits, churches,
Right.
had that requirement. If there are requirements in state law, I'll have to check that for you, but I think it's a wise requirement.
because that used to be, because we had the last, Forest Grove was the last one that I sat on, and Forest Grove, when I was there, had 19,000 people and 37 churches. So there was a chunk of the churches in the same area that would do it, but they all had access to facilities, and that's why some of them wouldn't, is if they only had internal bathrooms in the churches and they weren't fully staffed, they didn't want, to have people having to live at the church. And that was my only question about like private property, because it also, if it's on a piece of private property, if they just decide to close the facilities, that could put us out of compliance if someone
Well, it's not an only solution. We can't make it illegal to camp on all private or on all public property and say there's sufficient on private.
Oh.
Or we're gonna get bid. So you're right. The reason I'm interested in looking at residency on private property or looking at churches being allowed is I think it will reduce the wear and tear on the public property, if that makes sense.
Right.
So if there's a church that doesn't want to do that. The reason I'm interested in your question about is it state law is if it's an RV, in theory, it has a bathroom in it.
Right,
So is that requirement the same
right.
or not? And I'll find out. I didn't realize that was in state law, so I'll find out.
Yeah, I know in the past, the cities that I've been on, the lawyers have had questions that have gone back and forth and it was never, because obviously it wasn't, this bill hadn't been passed yet.
Yeah.
But the bigger question was just because it has a bathroom doesn't mean it was a functioning bathroom and they couldn't prove that. So we still had, cities were having issues with people having bathrooms and then them not being functioning and there's still being issues with like refuse outside of it.
Right. It's a very good question. And I saw those requirements in the ordinances we have that are models of that. I saw that requirement for access to facilities and I like it. And I don't know if any of the churches in town can be comfortable having their doors unlocked or not. Several decades ago, most churches had their doors unlocked all the
Yeah.
time. They're saying to refuge,
Right.
and it became dangerous and they didn't know. So I don't know. It would just depend. But that's also in a future slide. So I'm wondering. My first question for you is, do you want to do the minimum or do you want to dig in?
I think,
Dig in.
yes, dig it, just get it done.
We're here.
Yeah.
Let's hit another slide. Okay. So a camping ordinance could contain some or all of the following. We can do time, place, and manner restrictions on tent camping. We can do time, place, and manner restrictions on vehicular camping. Those do not have to be the same. Jeremy, you said something about, doing separate ones. We can have separate set of rules. Because they have different problems associated with them. It can be phrased to prohibit camping in certain areas or phrased to allow it in certain areas. And then, as we're just talking about camping on property owned by businesses, nonprofits, or churches, vehicular or non-vehicular camping on private property, and rules about illegal camp cleanup. And that's all the ordinances. And I think we don't need it yet, but we need in the ordinance to document how we will clean up. So the difference between prohibit and allow would be, we carve out a spot and we say, okay, the only place you can camp is the field north of City Hall.
Right.
There's your spot. There are advantages and disadvantages to that. Abby, who comes from a profoundly liberal background, grew up in Springfield, Eugene, and she looked at me and she said, Hillary, if you give up that land, you'll never get it back. Because I said, what about if we just used it until we were ready for a park? She said, you'll never get it back. And when you do, you'll have to do major cleanup to make sure you've got all the needles out of the soil and all the other things. And
Right.
contaminated. So, so land north of City Hall, the parking lot north of City Hall is a possibility, but I hate the idea of giving up the possibility of having a second park in town.
Right.
I would just scratch that
Yeah, come around.
completely.
That makes me happy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
So one is we can draw out a box, and say, this is where you can camp. If we do that, we need to make sure that area is reasonably safe, and we need to think about providing porta potties and garbage. Because otherwise we can create a public health hazard.
Right.
Because people start going to the bathroom in 5-gallon buckets and they store them or they dump them in the ditch or they do other terrible things with them. I don't know. But if we don't provide those things, we will have other problems.
and I think that is just, like I said before, an invitation.
Right.
yeah.
So
I 100% agree with you. I agree with Mary on that too. It scares me a little bit to do that. The other option is just to prohibit in certain areas that we want to protect. And this is, I think this was one of my recommendations when we hit the part where it says suggestions. Ross says in reasonability, that whole reasonability thing, we need to respond to the level of need we have in our community. Well, at this time in our community, as far as I know, we have some housing insecure people. And it's one of the reasons I want to crack open the camping on private property thing.
Right.
But I'm not aware of any tents or RVs. Well, with possible
There-
exception across the street from Jeremy.
There's on and off, there's RVs parked on West First Street.
and are they problematic?
No, they leave at night.
Because
They're there
the-
for,
The one that's across the street from my house, I haven't noticed
are you talking
any.
about the fifth wheel that was in the field?
Yeah,
That's gone. They moved it.
It's gone.
I'm 2 houses down. They moved it
Okay.
and mowed. It's been gone for, I think, 3 days now.
okay.
So,
They were just staying with the
with
neighbor.
the prohibit angle.
Yeah,
It was with the
prohibited
blue house.
In areas where
Yes,
it's not
yeah.
protected. But we wouldn't exclusively prohibit it in all of Halsey, which would let us be legal. So it would let us protect the parks and potentially residential neighborhoods. And that technically leaves it legal in commercial or industrial zones. But it doesn't hang out a sign and say, hey, come live here.
Right.
So that is a possibility. And at this point, I would lean toward the prohibiting in the areas we most want to protect and being silent in the other areas, but there's a choice there. I like the idea of allowing camping on businesses, nonprofits, churches, land with restrictions. Is another place, another outlet. And when the gentleman I mentioned before that had lived in Halsey a long time and then was homeless and then was living in an RV, at one point, one of the churches let him park in their parking lot for a little while. So, and it's not tearing up the streets,
Right.
not right in front of somebody's dining room window. It was relatively innocuous, when that was going. And then vehicular or non-vehicular camping on private property, I think if we're going to be forced to allow camping on public property, we need to talk about allowing it on private property, because I think it'd be much less. Well, one, that helps locals that are insecure because they're the ones who have family here or know somebody here.
Yeah.
And two, I think it will reduce the need to purchase land and create a camp for public camping. It'll delay that, I think, for a while.
It'll also prevent that potential pissing match later. Well, why do the homeless people get why can't we?
Oh, 100%.
My brother John is unemployed. Can he live in an RV in my backyard? Well, no, but technically he can live on the street and he can do it every 4 days.
Yeah.
And
Right.
if I were that person, I'd look at me and say, well, that's really stupid because you're not gonna be in anybody's way in my backyard. You want him out on the street?
Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Yes. So what I was thinking going through all these was use the Newport seemed like the closest to what I thought also was what we wanted to do. And it pretty much is relatively comprehensive. I mean, the municipal codes and everything, they're going to be different, but mixing and matching, cutting and pasting for our own purposes from Newport as a template for the camping ordinance makes sense. And then, then we move on to the RV ordinance, which I didn't see anything in here that was nearly as comprehensive. So that would be more mixing and matching and adding our own, flavor to that for what we need. But going back to the conversation with the RVs that were there currently and recently not being a problem, I think we need to preserve their ability to do that as long as they're acting within the rules that we set forth. And if they want to do it long-term, longer than 96 hours or whatever, I think we should create a permit that goes through the city where they have to tell us, who's living there. We have to get their vehicle information, just some specific things like that. So it's not really a deterrent. It's just, cover your own butt kind of thing. And then holding them accountable. Exactly. So if they're, an officer goes to the door, somebody who they don't have on their roster shows up and, they have a line of questioning that they can follow. Why are you here? What is your purpose? You weren't on the roster, those kind of things.
I like Newports. I like Jefferson's. And,
Medford has a bunch of really good
yeah,
RV associated.
those are my top three.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I have fewer flights for vehicle models, but I have a couple of them. Medford is one of them. Brownsville actually has some language on that, and it's my third.
Incredibly specific.
Ben has some. So yeah, all right. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so this reasonable time, place and manner, there were lots of good examples of these in the ordinance. Originally, Ross said no to me on the time because we talked in the April meeting about, well, what if, you know, they can only camp between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. And Ross said, well, worry, what if they, you know, work limits and they need to somewhere to sleep during the day? But what I saw for the ordinances that had a time restriction, they also had a little paragraph that said the city administrator can grant exceptions based on disability or unique circumstance. And I think that little paragraph keeps you legal. Because then somebody can say, Hillary, I work nights and I just need somewhere to sleep for 6 hours and and I can work with them on it. And I think that keeps us legal if you want to do time restrictions.
And that's a much better avenue than Roseburg's, which is incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God, I had to do that 3 times.
I like the idea that they've got to pack up their personal belongings and take them with them.
Yes, please.
Yep.
So I pulled out ones that I liked actually, but just examples, because there's lots and lots of them in here. I like saying they can't obstruct sidewalks, streets, entrances to building accesses, not near the road. And I like, obviously, not dumping gray water or sewage. There's a lot of very good ones in here, though.
I think on that one, adding to the dumping of not destroying ground. Purpose.
There were several in here about vandalism, damaging plants, damaging, yeah.
For tent camping, I know in the past, things that have helped cities that I've worked at is to set footprint limits.
Yeah.
So like a lot of the cities will be like 10 by 10 or 12 by 12. So it can't just like sprawl into an entire area. And then something else that we had better luck with was setting a limit on the number of facilities that we can have in a specific area. Because it stops the idea of like people forming cohesive camps,
Yeah, the space between.
which.
Yeah.
In all honesty, in Halsey, we don't have that much green space anyway, and more often than not, like most homeless people do not like to be super out in the open. So if they're camping where there's like 6 houses that can see them, probably not going to be their choice anyway, but it does make it easier when there's not, strength in numbers.
I also liked the ones that say you couldn't have any personal items outside of your tent or your vehicle.
Yeah, every city I've worked for, everything has to be contained in the tent.
Yeah.
And then we've also had very strict restrictions on any sort of flame because cook fires are the majority of the fires. And then animals. So animals have to be contained in a crate or on a leash at all times and cannot run loose.
And you can't restrict flame completely because of people's right to keep warm, but you can, I don't remember which one it was. It might be Newport. There were a couple of them where it was like it would be very safe.
Yeah.
Equipment. You can't just have an open campfire. More on these, or do you want the next slide?
Yeah.
Let's do the next slide. So vehicular camping on public property, examples of restrictions. I would like to not permit this in a residential zone, and some of these mentioned not adjacent to residences because there are some residences in the commercial zone. One issue about prohibiting it in the residential zone, I am concerned about the softness of our sides of our streets.
Right.
And a lot of heavy vehicles, I think, would potentially tear those up. I've also seen people trying to park by the side of the road and balance themselves half inside a ditch. Not permitted within 200 feet of a school or park was one that I liked. Not allowed to obstruct streets, driveways, building access, and vision clearance areas. Must be operable, legally drivable, must be at least 200 feet. And must move regularly, and that's a different distance and a different time period. I'm not really sure what they are, but I like the idea that they have to move regularly, and all person's property must be contained. These are ones kind of what Jeremy said is I don't have a really good example from just one ordinance on this, but these were things I pulled out of different ordinances that I liked that I thought would be good restrictions on camping. I like the idea of having them register or get a permit.
Yes. And then I would say 500 feet from the school or park, and I would say
Far away from those places.
and 50 feet from any residence.
There's a problem with 500 feet, and here's what it is. If we say you can't do it in residential, and then you draw a 500 feet ring around the Mennonite school and you drive a 500 feet ring around the Central Lynn Elementary, we've made it illegal everywhere except north of City Hall. So 200 feet, our block distances are 200 feet. 200 feet leaves a little space on West First near the warehouses and a little space on West Second where it's technically legal. We take it up to 500, we're back into that area where we've made it technically illegal everywhere in Halsey, and we're back into a risky zone.
Where's the Mennonite school?
But it's just across the tracks at the south end of town, just a little south.
Where you are.
The newer building that's
The-
big.
yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that was a school. Okay,
Yeah,
yeah, gotcha.
but 200 feet is one of our rules. So that means it can't be within a block of the school. So, but the other one you said was 50 feet from a residence. That works.
Because 20 feet is what a lot of them, or a few of them had in there, and 20 feet, I mean, that's
Not very much.
too close to my house.
Yeah.
20 feet is across the street from the house. The street is 20 feet wide.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Well, and I could see somebody saying, you know, from your actual residence, from your actual house instead of your property line. And so 20 feet from your house is different than 20 feet from your property.
yeah, 20 feet from your house is the sidewalk in front of your house.
Exactly.
Yep.
Okay. Next slide. So then the question, if we want to permit camping on business, church and nonprofit property with restrictions.
I'm for that. That
Me too.
is a good idea. It's just a matter of buy-in from the churches,
Outside of the thing.
you know, and.
I don't like that, for that one's in my backyard.
Well, and it's just an option, right? I mean, it's
No, I know, I
it's
was
not that people not making them do that. It's just providing the option.
It's just an option. It's
Yeah.
just the church can say,
No.
And that
Yeah, you're
would be
nice.
up to the church to operate.
Right, right.
yeah, the
And-
church might have a parishioner and they want to let them live in their parking lot. I mean, they would meet certain restrictions, but then they could do it.
One of the things that I keep coming back to is liability for the city. If somebody, we permit them to reside in a tent or RV for a period of time, do we take liability for them? So if they're on a city right of way or whatever, and they hurt themselves, are we liable?
We're gonna try not to. Some of those ordinances have clause saying, if you do this, it's
Right.
at your own risk. That said, I don't think the state has really looked at the idea. We've got recreational immunity for people using the park.
Right,
I haven't heard that they've established any kind of immunity for this.
right.
They should. That goes back to that unfunded mandate question, right? But as far as I know, no, but we will certainly put something in our ordinance saying,
Oh, absolutely.
use at your own risk.
Well, and the flip side of that is, can they be held accountable if they cause property damage, right?
Yeah, and I don't know.
Well,
And I don't know either.
I agree with you on that. The question is, so they do become liable. And they don't have anything to,
Right.
you know,
Yep.
is it worth going to court over it?
Well, there's some of these ordinances laid out, like if you don't follow these rules, you can be trespassed.
Right.
You know that from prior, I looked at it, I was like, are we allowed to do that?
Every city I've done has done that,
Okay,
but for just example, like the RV camping in every city I've had, we've always pretty much narrowed down where you could park, because the benefits to it are you don't have to keep enforcing it and telling people to move to the specific area. And it's also the police know a specific area that they can drive by and monitor.
Right.
The people who live here know a specific area we can drive by and monitor. And it leaves less leeway for people to try to find a loophole and put something somewhere. But we've always had, between Portland, Forest Grove and Beaverton, when I was there, we always had if you didn't meet X, Y, and Z, it was either you were trespassed or you got a notice from the city that you had 24 hours to remove everything. After that 24 hours, it got updated to the sheriff. Then the sheriff came and either knocked on, your tent, your door, and then you were gone. And most people leave because if you're forcibly evicted, you lose access to all of your possessions. So usually, if they already, people who don't have a lot of housing or don't have something, they can't necessarily afford to do that. So they tend to pack up and leave, because the idea of losing all of your possessions for being somewhere is a lot more dangerous than just,
Right.
going to Brownsville or Harrisburg for
Right.
the next week or something.
So we are allowed to have those teeth. We are allowed to say, if you do illegal things, if you vandalize the bathroom, if you, that we can say, sorry, you've lost your privilege of camping on public property.
Right.
Next slide, we're almost done with these. Okay, so this is something that I would like you to consider allowing, because I think it actually would help some housing residents that are housing insecure. And I think it would reduce the need for people to camp on public property. And if you're okay, I would, whatever we end up drafting, I would draft something allowing RVs, people to live in RVs on private property with some rules. They would need to come register, they would sign an agreement, they would have signed permission from the property owner, because the tenant might not be the property owner. They would, not discharge their waste into our sewer system. They would follow setbacks. So like, you can't build a fence right against or you can't build a shed right against your fence. You can't park an RV right against your fence because it's too close to your neighbor's property. So, I mean, these are my suggestions, but this to me is something that actually would be useful to some of our residents.
And could there be some wiggle room in there that if you had the residents adjoining that space, sign off and basically give permission, if you were in that situation where you didn't have a lot of room?
You could, but sometimes the person next to you is a jerk or just refuse to communicate. I've got a house with a falling down fence, and I have a concerned neighbor who would like to not look at the falling down fence, who's offered to rebuild it themselves. And I can't get the person who lives in that house to respond either to the neighbor or me. So we've got somebody who's willing to do it with their own money and just fix the fence, but they don't have permission to do it because they can't talk to the owner. So that's the one thing. If you had somebody in dire straits, would you want to have to wait on your neighbor to give permission if they were just non-responsive to that request?
Well, it's only in that situation where you're going to be closer than.
Oh, you mean closer than the?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
And you saw kind of like the same thing with sheds, where you can get like written permission from your neighbor to like build a shed closer.
Yeah, encroachment on the setback with neighbor permission.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
I know this situation, my daughter's living in a fifth wheel at my parents' house in Albany. Just because she has her dog and she can't find anywhere to live.
Yeah.
She's been there for a year and a half now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for me, I have some leniency towards this just because of my situation, but.
And we have had people live in RVs on private property, and when I get complaints about it, it is almost always because they're breaking the rule rather than because they're creating a problem, if that makes sense. Somebody's living in an RV,
Right.
but not, oh, they're up all night partying, there's garbage all over the place. Do you know what I mean? It's
Right.
right. So, and we have had people, well, I got a call a couple months ago from a gal who wanted to live in an RV on her mother's property because her mother was starting to need more care and she wanted to be close enough to do that, but she didn't want to live in her mother's 80-degree house. That's a little too hot for her. So
Stinky and.
I mean,
yeah.
there are situations where that would be
Yeah,
useful for families and care.
right.
All right, so those are my slides. And, oh yeah, timeline. This, we discussed on April 11th, we have a work session tonight. We can do a public hearing in June meeting. You actually can pass an ordinance in one meeting with 2 readings if it's unanimous. If it's not unanimous, then you need 2 meetings to pass the ordinance. The attorney, even though the ordinance won't have gone into effect by July 1st, if we have an ordinance that's been adopted by council, we're in a position where it would be really stupid for somebody to try to sue us because the judge is going to say, they've met their burden, there's no damage. Unless they show up at your tent with a ticket, they just wouldn't really have grounds.
Right.
So we would be in a much more secure place if we can get something done, something adopted by July 1st, even if it doesn't go into effect for 30 days. So this is a timeline, but if council is unanimous, you can adopt in a single meeting. We would read the ordinance title aloud twice.
And then that takes the place of a public hearing.
You don't have to have the public hearing at all. I was gonna create one simply for the fact that this is a controversial issue. You're gonna have neighbors, you may get neighbors that push at you, you're gonna have Mary Price yelling at you, so if we've
Please, no.
done a public hearing.
In my backyard.
If we've done a public
For
hearing,
real.
even if nobody comes, I mean, we'll publish it in the paper so they know they can come. People could come and talk too. That doesn't happen often, but once in a while, people do show up to our public hearings. But then there's just been that opportunity. It's like maybe a little bit more due diligence for council where you've given people an opportunity to speak to you.
Right.
You've heard them. And then you still know you have to make a hard decision. And even though everybody hates this, you're in the hot seat. I mean, it's fun sometimes, especially when you get to write grants and spend money. It sucks when you have to make an unpopular decision, but sometimes when you give people an opportunity to come talk to you about it, at least they feel heard. You're not obligated to do a public hearing. I threw that on there because I could put it in the June meeting if you wanted a public hearing, and that would be sort of a transparency due diligence kind of a thing.
So I guess my question is that part of the council meeting, the public hearing?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
June has 3 public hearings in it already. Have you been here for one, right? The mayor opens them and waits for somebody, nobody speaks, and
Anybody?
he closes them, and then he opens the next one and he reads, it takes him longer to read the script than it does to close the hearing because nobody wants to talk.
And nobody's here.
There's always going once, going twice. Moving on.
Which on
Okay.
this topic, I think we should do a public hearing because
I think so.
It's a due diligence thing.
with this
Yeah.
being a more hot button topic.
Yeah.
The same thing is gonna happen that happened last time with which we're a lot more lax than some of the bigger governments are, but we can't have another hour and a half of people just venting about it because it has to be done. Like, we have to be in state compliance and it doesn't matter what we choose, someone's gonna be unhappy with this. And that gives them a chance to talk.
And this gets structure.
Yeah.
Because the mayor will say, please keep your comments to 3 minutes. Somebody can stand up and say what they need to say. The mayor will say, thank you very much. The next person can stand up and say what they need to say for 3 minutes. The mayor will say, thank you very much. At the end, he'll close the meeting.
Yeah.
But then when you come down to the ordinance itself, if somebody starts trying to talk, the mayor can shut that down and say, no, we've already accepted public comment on this issue.
Which that's what I would like, because what happened last meeting, the reason why we were here for so long. I mean, it's, we let a lot of the community members voice their opinion. That
Side of
took 45 minutes to basically just tell us that they were unhappy that we have to do it.
Yeah.
So,
I think in a situation like that, it was a matter of, let's just get this over with out in the air right now, so that later on down the road. Not rehashing the same arguments. They've already vented.
Yeah.
It's out of it. And
no city I've worked for that we've done this, has anyone ever been happy?
Well, no.
It's not gonna.
And if you have somebody come to yell at you about it in 6 months, you can say, well, we did a public hearing, it's
Right.
published in the paper.
Or worry.
It was in our.
Are we going through that with the road right now and the curbs and the
Yes.
things, there were plenty of public hearings and options there, and unfortunately, it's out of our hands now.
And I mean, to be honest, people who are experiencing homelessness or house issues aren't always happy with stuff either. And it's not, the way that you would go, because to be frankly honest, I have lived in my car before in college. I paid for all of my college 100% myself. So there was times where it was either tuition and myself and my internet or rent. So I lived in a car and went to one of the most prestigious universities in Oregon and no one knew. And some of the restrictions that we had, I thought were stupid, and that was coming from someone who, in theory, they were supposed to benefit. But it's not always going to make everyone happy on the same accord, because there's a lot of people who live in cars or that are houseless and you won't know. And they'll come to work and they'll be perfectly clean and they'll do their homework and they have kids and they have a full-time job. And
That's what I was saying, how it is here in this.
I mean, I live
Too, that there are people,
Yeah.
and I mean, you even in the position you wouldn't know
Right.
that,
No, people don't I went to a college where most people's parents pay in a check. It was a $60,000 a year school. No one expected anyone to have that issue. I lived on I could buy a $40 parking pass at school. So I lived in my car instead of $1,000 a month rent. But the person who I would frequently like run into at the gym when we showered, because I use the school, had a master's degree and was working for Northwest Natural as an accountant. But it just happens, and it's not always great on some of the ordinances either that people are thinking are like trying to help it, so it doesn't, this is gonna make someone and everyone mad in some way or the other.
Yeah.
Um,
All right, I think that's it for my slides. So the question is, I mean, I like the idea of taking Newport's ordinance and revising it or tweaking it to make it suit Halsey. I guess the specifics I need from you are, where do you want it prohibited, or do you want to specifically allow it somewhere, and where do you want to specifically allow it? Are there specific restrictions you want on tents or specific restrictions you want on vehicles?
So that's where I was looking at the Medford or Jefferson had very specific where you are not allowed to. Sure.
I think they,
Newport did. also.
Newport's was,
Yeah, where's Jefferson did as well. I think, yeah, here we go. On page 19. Following city-owned facilities and located grounds that are open to the public. I think those specific city properties. And then there's a school. That 500 feet of the parcel containing an elementary school, we've already addressed that. 500 feet.
America.
Yeah, exactly, so
Yeah.
200.
So you
Take
want to
care.
put it at the park, library, city hall?
Yeah,
fire station.
oh, fire station.
And 200 feet from the school, is that what we decided?
Yeah.
Residential zone?
Yes,
Is there a distance from the railroad tracks?
Interestingly, that strip of land is owned by the railroads, so it's technically not public land. So I think that means the sheriff can enforce differently. It's not somewhere we're allowed to make open.
Corvallis is fighting that.
You're required to make open.
Right, that's why I mentioned it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think then it becomes trespass on private property, right?
I just wasn't sure what the buffer is there.
It's pretty big. I want to say it's 20 or 30 feet on each side. It's as wide as one of our streets and the railroads in the middle. It's up to you. You want it to be wider than that.
I mean, if it's already off limits, maybe we should just reiterate that in the ordinance,
Right,
find out what it is and just say,
Okay, yes, that makes sense.
definitely have a clean up. And I like the idea of the tent, 10 by 10 or
The what?
for tent, camping the 10 by 10.
I did find out, I said in the staff report, I was gonna find out, I did find out that the Lynn County Sheriff's putting up tents.
Okay.
Or clean up campgrounds. What they can't do that. One of those HBs, not 3115, the other one requires is store private property, store the property for 30 days.
Right.
So that would be on the city to do, and we might bring in a pod or something like that.
can we just use the storage units? Just rent a storage unit down at the,
Well, it's fenced, so it has to be easy for someone to retrieve. And what I don't think they've accounted for very well is how you know what belongs to whom,
Exactly.
right? There, you can't prove who owns what. So you
Like
have to
lost
have this
and found.
easy for them to retrieve, but they could come say, oh, that's sleeping bag's better than mine. I want, that one's mine.
Yeah,
I don't know how, we can't be, there's no way for us to, there's just no way. So we do the best we can. But I think because that is fenced, unless we.
Even if you had a pod, they can't like open it
Right.
into it.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's a good way to secure, I mean, we could say that that is securing their belongings until they're ready to come pick them up, and then they could, you know, make an appointment with either City Hall or whoever owns the storage unit to get in there. And as far as the knowing who goes to what, I mean, you label, you have a tent number and you put it in storage totes in together. And then you say, this was in your stuff. Nothing else was, here you go. And then dump it in the, you know, back of their cart or whatever. Just be done with it.
do you know, are they required to be able to access this 24 hours a day?
I was just looking at that.
It says that's easy to retrieve, staff workstation.
I think you could, I mean, if it's in the ordinance, we could just set a time, you know, open business.
Section 1D5A, all unclaimed personal property at the campus site that remains unclaimed after removal shall be given to law enforcement officials. Law enforcement official and local agency delivers the social services to homeless individuals. It doesn't really. All the unclaimed property must be stored. It doesn't say for how long though.
So we can set that. And somewhere it did.
Somewhere I saw 30 days, but
Yeah.
maybe that's,
And I think that was just something they said.
Property shall be stored for a minimum of 30 days during which it shall be reasonably available. Okay, so it does say, and that's later in.
and that's what catches me is that reasonably available thing.
I mean, I think that's reasonable
Yeah, right. I think it's reasonable.
business.
There's no definition of reasonable. We'll make.
I can't stop around the clock.
Right.
No, right. And I mean, we could even, I mean, we're paying the sheriff's office. It'd be nice if they would,
They said they won't. They will do the cleanup and they will store vehicles, but the small personal items, they said they don't have the capacity to store. But I'm still relieved by that because CIS,
not to store, to be on site when we return there.
oh, potentially.
So I mean, we would store it all. I mean, you could have, you know, 50 tents worth of business in one storage unit. But if somebody wanted to come claim it, have an officer on site to say, here, this is yours, this is not. There you go.
I just wonder if we'd be encroaching on reasonable then, because we'd have to schedule around when a sheriff would be available.
Well, that's what I started saying. We only have 72 hours a month. So if we have 3 tents to give back, then that's probably pretty easy. Unless it restricts the time it's available to them when we say, okay, you can't come until next Tuesday.
That's
But,
true.
if we have 40 tents and that exceeds our 72 hours of sheriff. I mean, it's a good idea, and I think my staff would be more comfortable with that, and we would probably try for that, but it might not always be.
Yeah, because I wouldn't want to be the person there
No.
Right.
turning
And
their
that
ear
is
to
just
them.
good twos. You know, so-
Yeah, absolutely.
At the moment, it's hypothetical.
But I mean, there's not very many of you either.
No, we can have,
Right, I know.
if
Yeah.
it has to just be a city employee, though, we can also see if Public Works can come and have someone else on site.
Well, that's what I meant, is
Yeah.
like, say me and Andy would do it
Yeah,
together,
right.
or, you know, Billy and Maddie would do it together, 2 people.
Yeah,
So that it's not just one, and yeah, we could pull from Public Works.
Yeah.
But I like the idea of having that be one of the things we ask the sheriff's deputy to do for us if they're available.
Potentially get warrants filled.
Do it.
Potentially get warrants filled.
Well, there's some language in here about if there's anything that's obviously illegal, the
Right.
sheriff gets to confiscate it.
Yep.
So. And I don't know how we determine what is garbage and what is somebody's precious object, but it also says that we can get rid of garbage immediately.
They have pretty general, they said if something is worth, you know, appears to be worth more than such and such.
Yeah.
In here somewhere. I remember reading it.
which something I just thought of that, I know we didn't touch on at this point, but for RVs and even to the tents, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to put language in for like restriction of gender, like generator use, because they're very loud.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that
I
was,
saw that in one of these.
Yep.
I liked that one.
that was mine in mine too.
Mhm.
It's a good call.
And that probably for private and public,
Right.
for any of it.
So on unclaimed property, Written notice must be as required. And states at the minimum where unclaimed property can be stored or will be stored, and a phone number that individuals can call to find out where property is and can be retrieved. So we have to have some sort of signage.
When we worked at Forest Grove, we just threw it in those like clear contractor bags, tied it and just wrote the location and the date that it was collected.
Okay,
And we just kept it in a closet at City Hall. Because we had space restrictions, so it usually wasn't that much stuff. If it's a 10 by 10 space, like unless they're Tetrising things inside of a tent.
Yeah.
They can have, if they have to pack it out with them anyway.
Right.
I like, there was something in one of these about not building structure or
Mhm.
tying things.
Read that one too.
Fire hydrants or. That, I liked that restriction as well.
Yeah, in most cities, we had restrictions on how close you could be to a fire hydrant in case there was an emergency. So it was always like basically the same thing for like parking or anything like that. It was, 15 or 20 feet from a hydrant, just so if someone did have to, if there was an emergency. Which I noticed that a few of the cities had in there also, which I'm not sure if it's something we would want to do now or potentially later, but it had the ability for the mayor to make emergency declarations to stop that. So if there was, some sort of like fire in a region of the city or a flood or something happened, that it could be suspended. And if we had people, since most people in Halsey do have RVs, so they don't have to like vacate the city if their, school and work and everything is here.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
How do we want to address potential pests? So if somebody comes when they have lice or rats or whatever.
Well, rats, I would tell you what I tell people about rats and mice now, which is that it's awfully hard to prove where they came from. And we like to say they came from under that wood pile because that person has trash.
Okay.
And to be honest, we are in a very small town surrounded by very big fields. We do have nuisance ordinance language about not accumulating food waste and things that attract rodents.
Right.
So it might be more a question of, yeah, you have food waste that, needs to be disposed of, you can't store that. But in terms of saying who brought the rats, I'm gonna tell you, we already have rats in Lexington.
Oh, yeah.
But if you have something about picking up your garbage
Yes,
or something.
well, that's
your food, but your,
Yeah.
but your food, but, yeah.
We want to have a health and human services type of a component where somebody comes in, is living in a tent and RV or whatever, we put them in contact with Lake County Public Health. And so if there is some sort of their carrier of something, they can be headed off.
largest cities that have local organizations, that is a part of what they're writing is. Or at least maybe not in their ordinances, but what they're trying to do is connect people with services. I guess the first thing I would do is find out from Lynn County Public Health is if they have somebody who would help people. Because it sounds great, but if they're gonna say, oh yeah, I can't help you call DHS, then I don't wanna say we're doing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There has to be something on the other end of that. But I can find out what support services might be available or who would be interested in that phone call.
And a couple of these places allowed camping in cemeteries,
Yeah, I saw that.
which I don't think we have any in town, but that just
Kind of creepy.
seemed a little weird.
Yeah, that's weird.
That's good. Well, and not that, but somebody who's bereaved should be able to visit a grave without
Exactly.
undue
Right.
other distress. I mean, without.
People RV camping in cemetery parking lots is actually really common. Actually the cemetery up on Power Line, there's a
I
big
know. I
fifth
saw-
wheel that parks there like at least.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's up there.
That's George.
Yeah.
He's a customer of mine.
He camps there all the time, but I
He
think
does.
super uncommon because
Yeah,
most cemeteries don't have a lot of people in there unless there's a wake, and then usually they'll,
quite the guy.
Yeah.
Well, they have a lot of people there. It's not really communicative.
yeah. They don't complain.
Yeah.
Nice quiet.
All right.
community.
Other things you want to see or don't want to see.
So Medford under page 24, under manor, like starting at obstruction, which is the last paragraph on page 24, and then all the way through XII, like all of those are really good.
Yes, yes.
Newport's definition is better for the open flame stuff, which is VII. So I crossed that one out. And then for XII, at the very bottom of the list, I just added no generators 10 PM to 6 AM. And those are all really good. And Newport didn't have a bunch of those incorporated into there. So if we're using that as a template, these would be add-ons to that.
Like that.
For allowing like RVs and camping on private property, do we want to put a restriction on how many can be per property?
That's.
Because I know in
Yeah. That is good.
in several cities, we've had people who have bigger yards, like all of the quarter acre lots in Halsey. They'll rent spaces, so they don't even know who's in their backyard. They'll just say like $25 a night, you can stay here forever, however long you need, and then, you'll see a backyard that has 8 tents in it with people who has no idea who they are because they're just paying for a spot.
They're just renting out some land. Yeah, one question is whether you want to allow tent camping on private property. The possible restrictions I put up that there was vehicles that are designed to be lived in. I mean, the state laws don't affect private property at all. You can keep it banned on private property, so you can set whatever restrictions you want. So I put vehicles that are designed to be lived in, whether that's a toy hauler with a cabin in front or a travel trailer, or camper, or RV. You can allow tent camping, and like I said, that one gal came back and she was in a tent for a little bit, and then somebody gave her a room in their house and helped her. It's actually a really sweet story. But
I mean, even RVs, I know on my house, large fifth wheels, I could fit probably 6 in my house.
Yeah.
And between our backyard and our giant driveway.
Yeah.
Without taking our parking spots that we have, because I know the people who lived there before us at one point had 3 in the backyard because the neighbor on the backside took a picture and showed us when they were collecting things on them.
what do you think is a reasonable number?
And cities I've worked at before, it's been between 2 and 3. So if someone has like a personal one that they're using and then like a family member staying, or like 2 family members for like 4th of July, but it basically prevents it from, if one family member has a house and there's 3 or 4 kids or whatever, that they don't have their house, and then their sons and their son-in-law and their daughter and like their uncle or whatever, like all parked.
And a lot would depends on also size of the lot.
Right.
If you have a small lot, then 1. If you have a larger lot, then 2.
Yeah, can you make restrictions based on square, like the actual property?
You sure can.
That's a lot of work.
How-
That's a
Right, I
lot
don't know
of,
how
It's a lot
deep we want to dive into that, but
that's a lot of, just figuring
You
everything.
get in a situation where you have people cramming a bunch of RVs with tents and they live on it.
Well, one is it has to fit on your property. I mean, there are properties in Blue Heron that are small enough. I don't know how you get more than 1 RV on them.
Right.
I mean, maybe if you have a crane to lift it into the backyard, but so to a certain extent, the size of the property and the
Right.
setbacks would address some of that, but I do think it's a good idea to have an upper limit.
I'm inclined to say no more than 2.
yeah, I kind of just set a number
And I'd say 3 just for,
I was- Like, I would say 3, just for, like you said, family.
exactly. And then,
Or if you have one, and then,
I'd like to, one thing might be just to set a restriction that it can't hang off your property onto private or onto public property.
Mhm.
Right.
Because we are saying not in residential zones. One things I've seen is people try to fit an RV and it doesn't really fit their property, so it hangs over onto the sidewalk and into the street.
Right.
So you might have somebody say, well, I have the right to have two RVs and they can only really get one on their property, so they angle the other one into the front yard, but it's hanging out into the street. Like to be able to say no to that, it can't cross the property line, if you're gonna have two, they gotta fit. up.
Within your own property line.
Public property.
And then do we want to invoke any kind of? So a couple of things we needed to talk about was enforcement, you know, who is gonna do that? And what are we gonna do? Because there, you know, with those two new cases, there were definitely things that we can't do, you know, you can't. There can't be a monetary value and there can't be criminal penalties associated with that. So basically, it's just a civil, you know, charge. But is there some kind of three-strike policy that we wanted to invoke for breaking the rules? So then if you do that, you know, whatever that violation is, 3 times that you lose the privilege to have 3 RVs on your place or whatever.
Oh, we're talking about the residency on private property.
Or camping, if you know, if you have stuff that's not self-contained, you know, outside of the tent or whatever.
Let's separate the private from the public, because the private, the answer is yes, you can have penalties and fines because the court cases have nothing to do with it.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So that can say part of our regular municipal code, if you have violations, you can get cited into court, you can pay a fine, do all that. So I would separate the private, but for public, yeah, and some of these are like, you can be trespassed, you can lose the privilege of living here
Right.
if you break it.
Yeah.
And that's not a financial, it's not a fine, but it's you can't.
Yeah.
Can't do anymore.
I like that. And then who would enforce that? Because some people had the,
Yeah.
they would be.
They have
Okay.
trespassing.
So we just need to be clear about that.
Yep.
And then exemptions, for camping, we discussed it a little bit. Exemptions for camping in the state of emergency by mayor declaration is what most of them did.
Yeah, and the thing, we didn't have built to do our code, but council did it unofficially during the fires a couple years ago. Just kind of lifted the restrictions on RVs in case people east of us needed to have a safe place.
Right.
And a lot of these talked about, you know, protecting residents, and they talked about, you know, both. It seemed like they were talking about folks that, you know, wandered into town and were camping on public property, but also, I mean, what's a resident? Is that someone who is a resident of a municipality, or just anyone who crosses the line into the city? Are they then a resident?
In terms of the public camping, I'm not sure we're allowed to make that distinction or fair.
Okay, so it'd be treated the same either way. Okay.
Mine's already bottomed out.
I know. I feel like a little kid.
Well, sometimes it defined what a resident was.
I couldn't find it in here. It seems like it should be.
I know I looked at it. I feel it's a definition, the delineation between transient and resident.
You remember which ordinance? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just wasn't sure. I was a little confused on that.
I wish I could that down my notes.
It would be really hard to prove one way or the other.
Right.
And I'm not sure we're allowed to make different rules for it anyways.
Okay.
I can find out if you want, but.
And we already discussed the pets were included in there.
What do you want with this? What do you want that to say?
Contained within.
Yeah,
Crate or on a leash,
yeah.
and they must
At all times.
maintain the waste.
Yeah, some of the cities, I mean, we were in Beaverton, we went as far as even like putting a restriction on the leash length, so we didn't have someone put a dog on like a 50-foot rope.
Oh, good
Right.
call.
We had, you know,
Clever.
like-
That's,
Yeah.
That's smart.
like a 15-foot leash or something, or a 10-foot leash, just so it's contained within that area.
yeah. And if it's a 10 by 10 space, a 10-foot leash is enough.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
which the other thing, I'm not sure if we talked about it while I was reading, and a lot of the cities for tents especially, we've had restrictions on that they have to be attended. So people can't put a tent and then leave for the entire day, so there's potentially no one there with like a dog that might get out and attack somebody or.
Right.
And that's what I liked about, you have to pack up all your stuff and take it with you. You can't set up a tent and leave it and walk away, you have to keep your stuff with you.
Yeah, we just saw, the Forest Grove lawyer, we literally had the words attended in it because people would take and be like, well, we'll pack up when we leave the time limit, but they would set up their tent and then take the bus to go take like a service. So if they were to like put their tent here and then go to Brownsville to the food bank and then come back, they could have a tent that's unattended for, you know, a period of hours. So the restrictions we had was there had to be someone physically associated with that tent on the site.
Okay, I like that.
RVs, we couldn't, obviously, you can't see who's in an RV without, you know, creeping, but a tent it's easy enough to like.
But if you had a dog in an RV, you have less of a chance of getting out.
We had the same, which had to be attended, it was obviously, we couldn't really enforce it, but for tents, it was an easier way, so we didn't have people like get a tent, and then especially since we don't have a bus line here, if they're walking somewhere, like it's a full day, like if they need to go to Harrisburg or something, they're gonna be gone
But
for.
also if the RV says a tent in it and it's sitting there empty for 3 days, it's really easy for the sheriff to tag on it.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about specific time restrictions? I threw some examples up there. There's examples in different ordinances. The one I don't like is actually Roseburg's, where it says between November 1 and February 28th, 5 p.m. to 8 a.m. during the months of March and October.
Too complicated.
No, it's too
Yeah,
complicated
right.
for them and for us. It needs, and for the sheriff who has to enforce it.
And the
Right.
more complicated you make it, the more chance to loophole.
Right. So I mean, I think time restrictions would not be a bad idea, as it's linked to that thing that lets me make an exception.
Right.
Keep us out of trouble.
I think what you had, 8 PM to 7 AM. I think that. Fine.
That's in most places too, because it's kind of after the bustle of the day is done and then before school and work commute and stuff.
Yeah.
Those were the big things I had for notes.
I think we've answered most of my questions.
I was just gonna say, how are you doing with
Yeah.
this? Are we getting info for you? Are you
Yeah, I
getting your
think
questions answered?
I think it's enough. What I think is that, I will do this as soon, there's obviously some gaps, and I'll take the time, place, and manner restrictions that you've identified. Probably read through some of them have like 3 pages, and in there were like this one. So I'll put together something, but I'm gonna try to get it out to you a week ahead of time before the council meeting to give you a chance to come back and say, okay, Hillary, we mentioned this in the work session, I don't see that in there. Or Hillary, I think there's a real problem with this restriction, I don't think you should put that in there. So that I can do a second revision before you see it in your June packet,
Okay.
which hopefully you may still have to do a second meeting, but hopefully to give you something that you might have a chance of putting through in one meeting instead of there being lots of weird little things to try to fix that. If that makes sense.
That does.
I'll do my best to get it out to you soon. It might not be the end of the week. It might be the beginning of next week, but I'll try to give you some lead time on it.
And I was gonna let you know, I'll send you an email too, but I'm not gonna be around for the July meeting.
July meeting tends to be pretty light.
It's good.
If you're gonna miss that one, miss that one.
Yeah.
Is Ken gonna be gone by July then? Because if Brandy's gone, we won't have
Since
the July meeting.
John has given council the ability to kind of flex that, my recommendation would be to fill Randy's seat and then fill Ken's seat and do a
Good call.
so that you never have more than one seat empty.
Since we kind of just talked to him a few times about June, I just want to make sure he didn't like, plan a vacation for like
July
first.
Yeah,
Right.
he did say he would stay up until the end of the year.
Yeah, he said it was more so good during the summer because of the heat and everything, so.
You might be anticipating this too now that raise.
Right.
True.
Right.
So that would be my recommendation is to do one and stay in place and then do this.
Mhm.
But you'll see in the newsletter though, because Ken was the one who declared before we did the newsletter, but you see in the newsletter is a thing for mentioning that he's gonna be retiring and collecting applications. I suspect somebody who wants to be on council won't care which seat they get put in.
Oh,
Right.
They're not gonna realistically know, I mean.
So,
Right.
yeah, so in the
I mean-
next meeting, you could declare the vacancy for Randy's seat and you could also go through the apps. For that.
Because we're gonna get lots of apps and maybe we could choose two and be done with it.
If you do appoint two people in one meeting, one Ken has to formally resign before you.
Oh,
fill the
right.
seat.
Mhm.
You could do that all, he could do that, he could say I resign and you could say I appoint.
Yeah.
But the other is to keep in mind that Randy's term ends in December 24 and Ken's ends in December 26. So you need to be specific about who you appoint to which term, so we know when their term ends.
Oh.
Okay.
Again, somebody wanting to sit on council probably won't be too picky, but
Right, yeah.
but you need to know because.
But we may need
official
to be.
and formal when somebody's term ends.
Let's see, I need to.
I think you'll do all right, so we're gonna give you the shorter term.
Our first choice is.
Yeah, right.
There may be that may.
Oh,
Yeah.
I play a role. You gotta be strategic.
So we all in consensus, good to go. Do you have everything you need, Hillary, or?
I think I have enough and I'll get something out to you as soon as I can so that you can read through a coherent one thing and give me notes back and then I can tweak it before the meeting.
So get something out to us, packet or email, where should be,
Oh.
I think we-
Sure.
I think packets, so we can make notes on it if we need be.
All right.
Yeah.
Plus, not everybody checks their email every day, which is fine because I don't email you every day. So, yeah, if it's okay, I'll send out a paper.
that's fine, I just wanted to
Right on.
clarify if it was email, so we could be checking it.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And okay, I know it won't be by Friday because I have to do payroll on Thursday, and some other meetings and stuff, but I'll try to do it by Monday or Tuesday next week, so you can have it pretty soon, so you can look at it. and get-
Monday's Memorial Day, so you should probably
Yeah, you
go
wanna do it?
kayaking.
Tuesday and Wednesday. I just lied to you. I will have to be by the end of this.
As long as you're going outside kayaking or doing something, we'll let you go.
Actually, I was gonna go.
Fantastic,
It's been over a year, so it'll be.
good.
Anybody else have anything? Nothing? Good to go. We're at 8:20. Thank you all very, very much.